August 11th, 1991, the fourth day of the fifth Test match between West Indies and England at the Oval in London is ongoing. Carl Hooper, the West Indian batsman, gets out for 54 off the bowling of Phil Tufnell. In comes Sir Vivian Richards to bat for the very last time in his illustrious career of 17 years. He had already announced that this was going to be his last Test match. A huge ovation erupts from the packed Oval crowd as he walks onto the ground with the score at 208 for 4, with West Indies needing 35 more runs to make England bat again in the second innings. West Indies are leading the series 2-1. Richards dazzles the crowd with his trademark shots, down the track, on drive, pull shots, off drives, square cuts. He gets to his 45th Test match 50 and then gets out caught at short mid-on off a mishit for 60. He admonishes himself for playing a loose shot and walks off the field for the last and 182nd time in his career. He gets a standing ovation from the crowd again and also the admiration of the England players. What a career. West Indies went on to lose the Test match in spite of a fighting 121 by Richie Richardson. The series is drawn at 2-2. England were finally able to draw a Test series against the West Indies for the very first time in 18 years. This match was not only significant for Vivian Richards' retirement, this was also the last match for one of the greatest fast bowlers of all time, Malcolm Marshall. It doesn't stop with that. Jeff Dujon, the best wicketkeeper of the 80s, and Gus Logie, a consistent number 6 batsman for the West Indies since the mid-80s, also retired. On top of this, Gordon Greenidge, one of the most swashbuckling openers of all time, had left the sport just before the England series as well. He had also played for 17 years. Losing 5 players of that caliber shocked the West Indies cricket team and its system. As a result, West Indies was rebuilding the team between 1991 and 1995 while still holding on to its record of not losing a single Test series since the late 1970s. During this period, West Indies lost 2 more stalwarts, Desmond Haynes in 1994 and Richie Richardson in 1995. All of these retirements hit West Indies hard as most of the successful 80s team was retired by the early to mid-90s. Courtney Walsh and Curtly Ambrose were the only remnants of the mighty 80s team of West Indies. Let's take a little trip down memory lane. West Indies was the preeminent superpower of the cricketing world from the mid-70s and throughout the whole 1980s. They won the 1975 and 1979 World Cups, and in Test cricket, they were unbeaten in a Test series since the umpiring-riddled 1979-1980 Test series against New Zealand. Clive Lloyd captained the team from 1975 to 1985, and he was one of the most successful Test match captains ever. He handed over the reins to Vivian Richards in 1985 with the team in top gear. During the peak of their powers, they had only lost 2 Test matches in a 6-year period. All aspects of their cricket was exceptional. They had the most fearsome batsmen in Vivian Richards, Gordon Greenidge, Clive Lloyd, and Desmond Haynes, and the most fearsome bowling attack in the world as well, with Marshall, Garner, Michael Holding, and Andy Roberts. The only period when West Indies was challenged consistently was between the late 1986 to mid-1988 when they drew 4 consecutive Test match series against Pakistan, 2 of them against Pakistan, 1 against New Zealand, and 1 against India. Much of this was primarily due to the fact that Michael Holding and Joel Garner had retired during that period. The bowling attack was going through a transition period, but with Malcolm Marshall in his prime, the bowlers like Walsh, Ambrose, and Patterson coming into the team, West Indies kept the momentum going somehow. This ensured that their victorious streak in the 1980s continued into the 90s as well. The earliest signs of trouble was in the middle order during the second half of the 1980s. Vivian Richards and Richie Richardson were both averaging around 50, but the next best was Gus Logie with an average of 36. The period here is between 1985 to 1990. Carl Hooper and Keith Atherton were brought into the team after Lloyd and Larry Gomes retired, but they couldn't measure up to the same level. There were some rumblings of poor bench strength, but all of this was masked by a stupendous bowling team and a great top four of Greenwich, Haynes, Richards, and Richardson. However, the retirements of the stalwarts in the early 90s stung the West Indies team really hard to the point that they could not mask it anymore. They had an answer for two of those great players. Brian Lara came in for Vivian Richards. Ambrose had already come in and he had adequately replaced Malcolm Marshall. However, there wasn't much of an answer for the others. Gordon Greenidge and Desmond Haynes were one of the best opening pairs of all time from 1978 all the way through 1991. After Greenidge retired in the mid 1991, West Indies started bleeding in the opening department. Phil Simmons came into the team to replace Greenidge but had a very poor average of just 25. Until 1994, Haynes was holding strong, but when he retired, it opened West Indies up to a lot more trouble. Sherwin Campbell and Stuart Williams were the mainstays at the top of the order throughout the rest of the 90s, but their averages were really underwhelming. Campbell had an average of 36 and Williams had an average of just 25. The deficiency in the opening department throughout the 90s was one of the top reasons for West Indies' start of their slump in performance, starting from 1996. The middle order, as a result, obviously faced a lot of pressure to perform, and in spite of having Lara, it wasn't easy. Going into the middle order, the period between 1995 to 1991 to 95 was especially excellent for the West Indian middle order in spite of Richards' retirement. This was possible only because of one reason: Brian Charles Lara. Lara averaged 61 during this period and he was in top form. He had great support from Jimmy Adams, Captain Richie Richardson, Carl Hooper, and a young Shivnarine Chandrapal, who had made his debut in 1994. This was a key reason for West Indies' success during this period. This period, however, saw their first ever series lost in 16 years to Australia at home in 1995. And coincidentally, this was also Richie Richardson's last Test match series before he would retire at the end of the 1996 World Cup, where West Indies lost to Australia in the semi-finals at Mohali in a very close game. Once Richardson retired in 1996, the West Indies middle order took a nosedive. The next 4 years, they were in such horrendous form that most of West Indies' decline can be pointed back at their fragile middle order, in addition to their top order being so bad. Lara averaged just 40, except the great series against the Australians in 1999 and versus England at home in 1998. There were no other good performances by Brian Lara. Carl Hooper, Shivnarine Chandrapal, and Jimmy Adams were also let down by averaging just mid to late 30s. Collectively, the West Indies batting let them down and thus getting whitewashed in 4 different series in that 5-year period. That was a huge fall down from the top. Remember that they were just on top until 1995. A deeper look at the data, however, shows that the batting power problems were exacerbated when West Indies played in away conditions. The middle order's collective average away from home was a paltry 26 in those 5 years. The openers were worse, having an average of just 22. This resulted in West Indies losing 20 out of its 24 test matches away from home during the 1996 to 2000 period. At home, the middle order averaged 36, whereas the openers averaged 32. clearly West Indies preferred playing at home in those 4 or 5 year period where they defeated England 3-1 in 1998 and drew against a top-notch Australian team 2-2 in the 1999 series, largely thanks to Brian Lara. We all remember his amazing 153 not out. As Marshall's career drew to a close, Ambrose's career was flourishing. He became the most feared bowler in the world and with Courtney Walsh became one of the best opening bowling combinations of the 1990s. They had plenty of competition in that era. They had Wasim Akram and Waqar Younis in Pakistan, Sean Pollock and Alan Donald from South Africa, and Glenn McGrath and Gillespie from Australia. The two of them became the two legs on which the West Indies bowling attack was standing on. From 1991 to 1995, there were no major issues in the bowling department, and there were enough support bowlers apart from Walsh and Ambrose, like Bishop, Benjamin, and some others who were good enough. However, in the 1996 to 2000 period, West Indies was purely dependent on Ambrose and Walsh. This is not a good situation. This is most telling in away matches where the duo had an average of 24 with 151 wickets, whereas no one else apart from them averaged even less than 30. In this period, Ambrose also suffered a couple of injuries due to which he couldn't play, which complicates the issue even more. There was just no bench strength, and the problem was plenty apparent that the moment Ambrose and Walsh retire, West Indies were going to go into a deeper decline, which is essentially what happened. After Richie Richardson exited the game, Courtney Walsh took over the captaincy for some time, but then passed on the buck to Brian Lara, and Brian Lara's stint as captain was replete with controversies, and his leadership was questioned due to repeated losses in away test matches. His own form also took a turn for the worse, unfortunately, and this caused even more issues. There were also some sponsorship, player contracts, and other disputes between the West Indies board and their players, and this was always boiling over. Jimmy Adams took over the captaincy from Brian Lara in 1999, and his handling of the team was definitely better, but nowhere close to the kind of leadership that Clive Lloyd, Vivian Richards, and Richie Richardson had showed in the previous 20 to 25 years. Captaincy became a big challenge for the West Indies, and it has always been so in the last 20 years. Only recently, with Jason Holder, do they have a decently stable leader in test matches at least. As the 20th century drew to a close, West Indies were still a force to reckon with at home, having won 11 test matches and losing just 3 in the 1996 to 2000 period. But they were horrendous travelers, as you already saw. Thanks to a mixture of bad form, smarter opposition bowlers, and a poor management of their players by the West Indies board, the batting lineup was largely responsible for the start of the great West Indian decline that we are still hoping it would be able to get out of. By the early 90s, Brian Lara and Shivnarine Chandrapal got back to top form and have the formidable support at the top of the order from Chris Gale, something that was missing in the 90s, and they also added bonus was they had Ramnaresh Sarwan providing some stability in the lower middle order. However, the timing was such that both Ambrose and Walsh had retired by mid-2001, leaving the West Indies utterly vulnerable in the bowling department with hardly any great bowlers there. The best West Indies bowler in the early 2000s had an average of just 30, and this period was 2001 to 5. Unfortunately, West Indies continued to decline, and even though Brian Lara's last few years were remarkable and hit a purple patch, there were not many victories to cherish. After Lara retired, Shivnarine Chandrapal also had a few phenomenal years with the bat, but he was a lone warrior and West Indies were not winning enough. And this problem continued to dog them all the way through 2018-19. Only very recently there seems to be a little light at the end of the tunnel, with West Indies regaining some of its bowling strength finally. Their batting is still nowhere near where it used to be, but the optimist in me thinks that maybe there is something coming there. Hopefully.